guys, my name is Jennifer, and I found a treasure map. Soon, you'll learn from this story if I became rich and what I had to live through for the sake of receiving the treasure. My mom's dad was a very rich man, and he insisted that Mom marry his friend's son, but she refused and married my dad, which made my grandfather very angry, and as a result, they completely stopped talking to each other. Many years passed since then, and one day some stranger called us. He introduced himself as a lawyer and said that my grandfather had recently died and had not left a will. That's why my mother was the only heir. Despite the heritage, it was very sad news because my mom was going to meet her father for reconciliation, but it turned out that it was too late. To our surprise, Grandpa managed to sell his mansion, and we got only his small country house. But what happened to all of his money and bank accounts? We decided to search the house, but unfortunately, I didn't find anything. There was only a lot of furniture in the house that was much older than my parents. There was a feeling that we were in the period of 40 years ago. Then my parents went to inspect the garage while I decided to check out the attic. It was terribly dusty there, and it seemed that in those 40 years, no man had stepped there, although the rest of the house had been completely cleaned up. There were only 2 boxes in the pile of dust. I opened the one that was closest to me and saw many very old letters. Then in the second box, I found toys and a handmade map with a place marked with a cross. It was there that my grandpa left his wealth, I thought, and decided not to tell my parents about what I'd found because they'd never give me money. But at that time, I could take part of the heritage for myself and give them the rest. After all, it was I who found the map, so it would be fair. My parents did not find anything in the garage and soon returned to the house. I told them about the letters in the attic, and we began to read them. There were love letters from my granny and from Grandpa's former frontline comrade named Oliver. The last letter was written 20 years ago, around the time that my parents met. In it, Oliver told my grandpa that he had a huge health problem and asked him to take care of Martin, who was his son, as we had learned from previous letters. Then my parents thought that my grandpa gave all the money to that Martin, and in order to check this, they decided to find him. While I went to look for treasure, I felt a little sorry for my parents because I knew that they were going the wrong way, but I thought they would forgive me when they saw the inheritance. When I got down to business, I could not understand what kind of place was shown on the map until I remembered my mother's stories from childhood about an abandoned hut. When I got there, it all came together, but the marketplace was behind a high fence on a land plot near a private house. I began to think, how could I get there? If I had told the truth, the owners would have taken the treasure for themselves because it was on their land, so I had to look for other options. Suddenly, I noticed a girl about my age leaving this house. Perfect, I thought, and started following her. Soon, she walked into the bookstore and I entered it after her, noticing that she was standing at the shelves with detective stories. I came up to her and started a conversation. We had a lot in common, so we quickly found a common language. Her name was Sharon, and her family moved there immediately after she was born, so most likely that place had no other owners. Before, this meant that no one had managed to dig up the treasure because Sharon's family could not be called rich. That evening, my parents told me to search for Martin. It was necessary to go to the coast located 1,000 kilometers away from there and that we needed to leave. I just could not let this happen, so I staged a real performance pretending that I had lost my documents, injured my hand, and got hysterical. In the end, with great difficulty, I managed to achieve my goal. My parents allowed me to stay at my grandfather's house for a few days before they would come back. While being left alone, I continued to get closer to Sharon. Every day we went out together, went shopping, and I have already visited her house 3 times and saw that very place with the treasure. The only thing left was to wait until the right moment. And this moment came. Sharon's parents were away for the whole weekend, and she invited me to her place for this time. She didn't want to stay alone for 2 days, and I needed my grandfather's treasure. So, of course, I agreed. During the first day, we had fun. And when Sharon went to bed, I found a shovel in the garage and walked to the cherished place. I was digging until morning. It was very hard and caused physical pain. My muscles were trembling because of exhaustion, but I could not stop. I had to do it either at that moment or never having dug up the entire land plot where the treasure was supposed to be. I never managed to find that cherished chest. I understood that in the morning, Sharon would see the results of my excavations, and I would find myself in an uncomfortable situation. So I decided to be proactive. I woke up Sharon and told her everything, showed the hole that I had managed to dig out at night, and showed the map. However, contrary to my expectations, Sharon was not happy with my revelations. She got really mad, called me a greedy girl, and yelled at me, ordering me to immediately get out of her house. It took me tremendous effort to persuade her not to make me go away and look for the treasure together. We agreed that we would divide in half the treasure that we would find and go our separate ways, forgetting about each other's existence. And I started digging again. Every muscle in my body was aching and hurting, and from time to time I passed out and fell asleep, but came to my senses. As soon as I started to fall down, Sharon had much more energy and she was digging much more enthusiastically and quickly. At the same time, she was grumbling, saying how selfish I was and how much I hurt her by using her for my own purposes. I had no choice but to silently listen to everything she was saying. After all, in many aspects, she was right. After a while, my parents called me and I was distracted talking to them. Meanwhile, Sharon found something underground and a minute later pulled out the chest and began to open it right there. Finally, I thought. So somehow, I ended the conversation with my parents, who asked me a lot of questions and told me something about Martin. But I did not listen to them because all my attention was directed to that treasure chest. As soon as I finished talking, I immediately went to Sharon, who was really mad for some reason. "Take your treasure," she said, and threw a bunch of branches at me. "How dare you mock me?" I shouted and threw myself at her. But since all my muscles were aching and we had no energy at all, the fight quickly ended. Being exhausted, we sat down on the ground, and Sharon said that these branches were what was inside the chest, and next to it there was a note with the inscription Armory and the date 1956. Apparently, when Grandpa hid this treasure, he was only 8 years old. And then it is clear where the branches came from inside. I can't tell you how disappointed and frustrated I was. All this time I was chasing branches. Do you get it? Branches? This was a total failure. Fortunately, by that time, my parents had just arrived and they took me home, saying that we had nothing else to do in that place. On the way, they told me a very interesting story that put everything in its place. It turned out that Martin's father saved my grandpa's life during the war, but because of this, he became disabled himself. Grandpa felt obligated to him, and due to this, he spent a lot of money on the treatment of his friend. This helped Martin's father live longer, but alas, he was not completely cured. Having spent the lion's share of his fortune on treating his friend, my grandpa realized that he was running out of money, so he wanted to make my mother marry the son of a rich man, but she refused and ran away. This was when he received the letter with a request to take care of Martin. Grandpa found Martin and learned that he was going to enter university and sold his mansion to pay for his studies at the best university in the country and then disappeared. Martin took the chance and became a successful businessman, and then he had a desire to return the money to my grandfather, but he could not find him. However, as soon as Mom and Dad found him, he happily returned the debt to her. Have you ever looked for treasure? Tell us about your experience in the comments. Click on the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel. Hi everyone, my name is Amy. Wow, so I don't even know where to start. My parents decided to go on vacation without me, even though I wanted to go. But the weird thing is that after they came back from vacation, they seemed like they had been replaced. They started acting really suspiciously, and I was sure they weren't my parents at all. I mean, on the outside they looked the same, but the way they behaved, they had to be imposters. Anyway, this is all pretty confusing, so just listen, okay? You know, I always wanted an ideal family like you see in the movies. The kind where the mom roasts a turkey in an apron for Thanksgiving and the dad carves it up for everyone. Unfortunately, my parents aren't like that at all. I mean, they're fine, but it would be a lie to say they're doting parents, had a perfect marriage. For as long as I can remember, Mom and Dad have always fought. Mom would yell at Dad for lazing around the house doing nothing, and Dad would yell back saying that Mom is a bad housewife, that cooking is gross, and the house is always dirty. Those fights usually ended with dishes getting smashed. Then Dad would smoke almost a dozen cigarettes to calm down and start coughing up a lung. One time, Mom and Dad were having a really big fight. Mom told me to go to my room, shut the door, and not come out until she said so. So what choice did I have? I went to my room, and as soon as they heard me slam the door angrily, they started shouting at each other and calling each other some pretty awful names. I heard the usual sound of breaking dishes. It sounded like they had made their way to the last of the ceramic plates. I tried not to think about it. I put on some headphones and blasted some music out loud so I couldn't hear them, but it didn't help that frustrated tears started running down my cheeks anyway. He pissed me off. All the other kids had nice, caring parents. Why did I get stuck with them? The next day after school, I came home to find my parents with their suitcases packed. Dad also pointed to my suitcase. He said that he and Mom needed to go on vacation, just the two of them, so I would have to stay with my grandparents for a while. I stayed with them often, sometimes for several days at a time, but this time it's going to be for longer than usual. My mom told me she and Dad would be gone for 2 months. Imagine, they were leaving me behind for 2 months. I tried to get them to take me too, but nothing I said worked. An hour later, I was standing on my grandparents' doorsteps, waving as my parents drove away. Surprisingly, the next 2 months went by pretty fast. I kept going to school, watching TV with my grandfather in the evenings, or helping my grandmother in the kitchen. But I really missed my parents and wanted to call them. The strangest thing, though, was that my parents hadn't told anyone where they were going or how to contact them. One day, the front doorbell finally rang. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, and there were my parents. It looked like the vacation was good for them. They looked great. Dad smiled, a bright white smile. Weird. They were so yellow because of his smoking habit, and Mom seemed 10 years younger. They were both well-dressed, too. I threw myself into their arms. My grandma and grandpa were also pleasantly surprised after a group hug. My parents drove me home. I was glad to finally be back with them. Everything was back to normal, and my parents told me over dinner how amazing the vacation was. Mom said that she and Dad spent hours lying on the beach, swimming in the sea. I looked at them both. If they spent so much time in the sun, why were they so pale? Where's your tan? I asked. Mom and Dad glanced at each other and gave me these weirdly forced smiles. Then I decided to press and find out everything. I asked why my dad's teeth were so white. He smiled and replied that he had quit smoking. But how is that possible in just 2 months? He smoked like a chimney. But the most amazing thing was that the dinner was really delicious, and Mom was the one who cooked it. My mom asked me to turn on the stove because she doesn't know. What's going on? Who were these people at the table with me? My thoughts were interrupted by Dad's phone going off. He quickly got up from the table and walked off somewhere private. Mom sent me to my room and went after Dad to discuss something. I was ready for the usual screams and fighting, but nothing happened. It's not that I want my parents to start yelling at each other, but that is what usually happened when they sent me to my room. Then I went back downstairs. Mom was washing the dishes and Dad was going somewhere. My mom never washed the dishes right away. She would let them sit in the sink for days, and Dad never left at night before. When I asked where he was going so late, Dad was the only one. He and Mom were clearly worried about something, and that's how things were for the next few days. Mom ran around the house tidying up, and Dad went somewhere every night. One evening after dinner, my dad got another phone call. These calls came every night at the same time, and Dad always went somewhere else to talk. This time, I decided to listen in on his conversation with the excuse that I needed to use the bathroom really badly. I left the table and I followed him. I heard a menacing voice on the other end, and Dad said that they would get the money. They just needed a little more time. I gasped. My parents were keeping a big secret from me. I finally decided I was going to figure out what was going on. That night, I woke up to a strange rustling sound. I realized they were coming from my parents' room. I carefully opened their door, just a crack. Through the darkness, I saw my parents holding flashlights as I rushed madly around the room, collecting all the money, Mom's jewelry, and any other valuables into a bag. I covered my mouth with my hands so they wouldn't hear me gasp. Why were my mom and dad acting so weird? Why would they steal their own stuff? But what if they weren't my parents at all and just someone pretending to be them so they could rob us? Yeah, okay, it sounds like nonsense, but I needed to be sure. I sat down at the computer and started looking it up. It turned out that there were cases in several states where scam artists pretended to be close relatives. As I was now stuck in a house with thieves pretending to be my parents, I got scared and locked the door to my bedroom. In the morning, I discovered that half of the furniture and appliances in our house had disappeared. There was no TV, no microwave, no iron. That's when I realized that all my crazy ideas about imposters might not be so crazy. Instead of going to school, I ran to my grandparents' house to tell them everything. But they said my suspicions were stupid, even though my parents' behavior seemed strange to them too. It seemed the scammers posing as my parents had managed to cheat the elderly, but it wasn't going to work on me. I decided to watch my so-called parents until I could prove that they were just crooks. It didn't take long. When I got home, there was a huge van in front of our house where my fake dad was loading all of the loot. To find out where he was taking it, I sneakily climbed into the back of the van and hid behind one of the chairs. When Dad came back, he closed the door, and I was suddenly in complete darkness. The van started up and started moving. I was really uncomfortable, to be honest, but I had to find out the truth. The van drove for a long time, and I even fell asleep. I woke up when it stopped abruptly. Dad opened the door and started carrying our furniture and equipment somewhere. First, he took the bag of jewelry that he and Mom, or well, his partner, collected that night. When Dad left, I seized the opportunity to jump out of the back. I hid behind some nearby bushes and watched him from there. Imagine my surprise when I realized that he carried all the valuables from our house to the pawn shop. I took a couple of pictures with my phone after he unloaded everything. My dad came out of the shop with a wad of cash. I took a picture of that on my phone. Finally, I had my hands on some evidence and could go to the police. Maybe this was the same gang that had scammed people in other states. Who knew, after all? They were never caught. I went straight to the police station. To my surprise, they sent me to a Detective Johnson who didn't tell me I was being silly or that my ideas were nonsense, but actually praised me and said that I might be right. The imposters I had looked into recently carried out another scam in our state. When he said that, I was finally sure that the people in my house were just thieves who might be holding my real parents hostage. The detective put me in a patrol car and took me to my house. When we got there, he jumped out of the car and ran into the house. I followed him. The scammers were already sitting there with their hands up with horror on their faces. The detectives told them to confess everything. Then my so-called parents started telling their story. Mom said they didn't go on vacation at all, but to some amazing center for building a better family, and they weren't replaced. They changed. Dad quit smoking. Mom learned to cook by taking culinary courses. And most importantly, they finally figured out their relationship. They did all of it to make our family stronger. I was starting to get it. But Detective Johnson was determined and kept asking questions. For example, where and why did Dad take all of our belongings? Dad said that he and Mother decided to sell everything of value in order to pay off that Center for Help, which was really expensive. My dad even had to get a job as a night watchman. According to my mother, it was all worth it, though. Now the officer had gotten enough information from my parents. Realizing the absurdity of the situation, he blushed, apologized, and decided to quickly leave the house. I went over to my parents and hugged them as tightly as I could. That's my story. Tell me, have you ever noticed something suspicious about your parents' behavior? If you have, then like and share it in the comments.